It was supposed to be a moment of transition, a new year, a new beginning. For Anna Walshe, the first days of January 2023 were meant to mark a turning point. A wedding was approaching, plans were being made, life was moving forward. But on the morning of January 4th, something quietly went wrong. Anna never showed up for work. At first, it didn't seem alarming. She was a senior professional, a mother of three, someone juggling responsibilities across 2 states. Missing a single day didn't immediately suggest danger, but as the morning passed, and then the afternoon, and then the evening, there was still no word from her, no phone call, no message, no explanation. By nightfall, the silence felt heavy. Those who knew Anna described her as dependable, organized, someone who didn't simply disappear without telling anyone. And yet, by the end of that day, no one could say where she was or when she had last been seen. When police were finally notified, they began with the most obvious question. Where was the last place Anna had been? The answer was chilling in its simplicity. Home. Anna was last known to be inside her own house in Cohasset, Massachusetts, a quiet suburban neighborhood, a place associated with safety, routine, and familiarity. There were no signs of forced entry, no reports of shouting, no visible struggle. Her car was still there. Her belongings remained behind. It was as if Anna had simply vanished. Investigators quickly realized this wasn't a typical missing person case. There was no clear starting point, no obvious trail, just an unsettling absence inside a space where nothing appeared disturbed. And then attention turned to the one person who had been closest to her, her husband. He told investigators that Anna had left early in the morning for a work trip, that she had planned to travel to Washington, D.C., that everything was normal. But as police began checking timelines, reviewing records, and asking more detailed questions, cracks started to appear. Details didn't line up, times were unclear, and small inconsistencies began to pile up. What had initially seemed like a straightforward explanation slowly became something else entirely. Because behind the calm exterior of this quiet neighborhood, a disturbing story was beginning to take shape. A story that would soon involve surveillance cameras, digital footprints, and discoveries so unsettling they would change the direction of the case forever. This wasn't just about a woman who didn't come home. It was about what happened inside that house, what was seen and what was hidden, and how a disappearance just days before a wedding would unravel into one of the most disturbing cases in recent memory. And this was only the beginning. To understand why Anna Walshe's disappearance shook so many people, you first have to understand who she was. Anna wasn't someone who faded into the background. She was driven, focused, meticulous. Those who worked with her described her as intelligent and ambitious, someone who took her responsibilities seriously and expected the same from others. She had built a successful career in real estate and property management, balancing high-level work with the demands of family life. At home, Anna was a mother of 3 young boys. Friends said her children were the center of her world. Her life revolved around schedules, routines, and structure. School mornings, meals, bedtimes, planning ahead. Anna was not the kind of person who vanished without a plan, especially not without arranging care for her children. And that detail would later become impossible to ignore. In the days before her disappearance, Anna appeared to be looking forward. There were wedding plans, travel arrangements, conversations about the future. To those around her, nothing suggested she was preparing to disappear or leave her life behind. But beneath the surface, not everything was as stable as it seemed. Anna's marriage was complicated. She and her husband, Brian Walshe, were living a largely long-distance life. Work had pulled them in different directions. Time together was limited. Stress was constant. And while outwardly things appeared functional, the reality behind closed doors was far more strained. Friends later recalled tension, distance, unspoken pressure. Still, there was no indication Anna felt unsafe. No known plans to leave. No messages suggesting fear or desperation, which made what happened next all the more disturbing. Because the person Ana trusted most, the person sharing her home, was the same person who would soon become the focal point of the investigation. And as police began reconstructing Ana's final days, they realized something unsettling. The story being told didn't match the woman they were learning about. A mother who planned everything, a professional who communicated clearly, a bride days away from her wedding. And yet, according to the official account, she had simply left quietly early in the morning without notifying anyone. No goodbye, no confirmation, no trace. The more investigators learned about who Anna Walshe truly was, the harder it became to believe that her disappearance was accidental or voluntary. And as the search widened, one uncomfortable truth became clear. If Ana didn't leave on her own, then whatever happened to her had begun much closer to home than anyone wanted to admit. In the next part, attention would turn fully to the timeline, the last hours Ana was known to be alive, and the story that would begin to fall apart under scrutiny. When investigators began reconstructing Anna Walshe's final hours, they expected clarity. Instead, they found confusion. According to the initial account, Ana was last seen in the early hours of January 1st. She was said to have left her home quietly, planning to travel for work. No witnesses, no confirmation, just a statement. But as police began verifying that story, the timeline started to fracture. There was no record of Ana arriving at an airport, no footage of her entering the terminal, no evidence that she boarded a flight. Her phone activity didn't align with travel. Her credit card showed no movement, and no rideshare, taxi, or public transportation records placed her anywhere outside the home. The more investigators searched, the clearer it became. Ana's disappearance didn't begin somewhere on the road. It began inside the house. When police asked detailed questions about the hours before she was supposedly last seen, answers became vague. Time shifted. Details blurred. Events that should have been memorable felt oddly unclear. What time did Ana wake up? What was she wearing? What exactly did she say before leaving? Each answer raised more questions than it resolved. Then there was the silence. No goodbye message to her children. No call to a colleague. No confirmation she had arrived anywhere. For a woman described as careful and communicative, the absence of any digital footprint was deeply unsettling. Investigators also noticed something else. There were no reports of Ana being seen by neighbors. No doorbell cameras captured her leaving. No street cameras showed her walking away. If she had left the house, she did so without being seen by anyone or anything. As detectives reviewed the layout of the neighborhood, that detail became harder to dismiss. This wasn't an isolated home. Cameras were everywhere. Movement was usually recorded. And yet, Ana seemed to vanish without a trace. The timeline continued to collapse under scrutiny. Hours that should have been accounted for remained unaccounted for. Movements that should have left evidence didn't, and explanations that initially sounded reasonable now felt increasingly implausible. By this point, investigators were no longer asking where Ana went. They were asking when she truly disappeared. And more importantly, who was with her when it happened? Because as the timeline narrowed, suspicion narrowed with it. What happened to Anna Walshe didn't unfold over days. It unfolded over hours. And as police would soon discover, the answers weren't hidden miles away. They were hidden in plain sight, captured silently, waiting to be found. In the next part, that silence would be broken, not by a witness, but by something far colder: surveillance. Up to this point, Anna Walshe's disappearance was built on absence. No witnesses, no confirmed sightings, no clear trail. But that silence was about to be broken, not by a person, not by a confession, but by cameras. As investigators expanded their search beyond the home, they began pulling surveillance footage from nearby stores, streets, and transit areas. They weren't expecting answers, right? Away just fragments. Anything that could help anchor the timeline. What they found did exactly that. Late-night footage from a local hardware store showed something unexpected. Ana's husband. The time stamp mattered. The purchases mattered even more. Cleaning supplies, protective items, tools that didn't align with a man searching for his missing wife. At first glance, none of it was illegal. But taken together and placed within the collapsing timeline, it was deeply unsettling. Investigators checked additional locations. More footage appeared, more time stops, more late-night movements. Each clip placed Anna's husband exactly where he said he wasn't. At times he claimed to be asleep, grieving, or unaware that anything was wrong. The story he had told police no longer fit the evidence. And the deeper investigators looked, the clearer it became that these weren't random errands. They were deliberate, repeated, purposeful. Surveillance didn't show panic. It didn't show confusion. It showed calm. That calm was chilling. Because while Ana was missing, while friends and colleagues were growing increasingly concerned, someone else was moving through the night, methodically, leaving behind a trail that cameras would later expose. As police synchronized the footage with phone records and statements, the timeline snapped into focus. This wasn't a disappearance that unfolded in the open. It was one that had been quietly managed, and the realization hit hard. If Ana had left on her own, none of this made sense. But if she hadn't, then the footage wasn't just suspicious. It was damning. From this moment on, the investigation shifted. Anna Walshe was no longer just a missing person. She was the center of a rapidly forming criminal case. And as investigators continued piecing together what those cameras had captured, one unsettling truth emerged. The answers weren't hidden far away. They were recorded frame by frame, waiting to be understood. In the next part, attention would turn to something even more disturbing than surveillance footage: digital evidence. Evidence that suggested forethought, intent, and a truth far darker than anyone had prepared for. By now, the case surrounding Anna Walshe had changed. Investigators were no longer asking if something was wrong. They were asking how far it went. As surveillance footage reshaped the timeline, detectives turned to another source of truth, one far quieter but often more revealing: digital history. What they uncovered would mark a turning point. Search records connected to Anna's husband revealed a series of online queries made shortly after her disappearance. At first, they seemed random, disconnected, almost ordinary. But as investigators read through them, a pattern began to emerge. The searches weren't about finding a missing person. They weren't about contacting authorities. They weren't about concern. They were about something else entirely: methods, processes, questions no one expects to see in the wake of a loved one vanishing. Each query on its own might have been explainable, but together they painted a picture that was deeply unsettling. This was not someone reacting in panic. This was someone seeking information. The tone of the searches mattered. The timing mattered even more. They appeared during a narrow window after Ana was last believed to be alive, but before anyone else knew she was missing. That gap was critical, because it suggested something investigators had been reluctant to say out loud: forethought. As detectives cross-referenced the digital data with the surveillance footage, the pieces began to lock together. The late-night movements, the purchases, the online activity. None of it pointed toward confusion or grief. It pointed toward preparation. The case crossed a line at that moment. What had once been a troubling disappearance now carried the unmistakable weight of intent. And with that realization came a shift in urgency. This was no longer about finding Ana. It was about understanding what had already happened to her. As the investigation intensified, authorities began focusing on physical spaces where evidence could be hidden, altered, or destroyed. And what they would soon uncover would only deepen the sense that Anna Walshe's fate had been sealed long before anyone reported her missing. In the next part, investigators would confront the physical evidence: what was found, what was missing, and what it revealed about the final hours of Anna's life. Once investigators stepped away from screens and timelines, the focus shifted to something far more tangible: physical evidence. Up until now, suspicion had been built on patterns, movements, searches, inconsistencies. But to understand what truly happened to Anna Walshe, detectives needed more than behavior. They needed proof. Search warrants were executed. Locations tied to the case were examined, carefully, methodically. Every room, every surface, every item that might have seemed insignificant days earlier was now treated as a potential clue. And slowly, the picture began to change. Investigators recovered items that raised immediate concern. Objects that suggested not a sudden disappearance, but deliberate action. Some were ordinary on their own. Others were difficult to explain away. Together, they told a story. Traces appeared where none were expected. Signs of cleaning where there had been no mess. Gaps where items should have been. This wasn't chaos. It was control. Detectives noted the effort involved, the time it would have taken, the intention behind each step. Nothing about what they were seeing suggested panic or accident. It suggested method. As evidence was collected and analyzed, investigators began to understand something deeply unsettling. Whatever happened to Anna did not occur in a single moment. It unfolded over time. And the absence of certain things, the things that weren't found, was just as telling as what was. No personal items recovered. No sign she had prepared to leave. No indication of a voluntary departure. Instead, what remained were fragments, pieces left behind not because they were meaningless, but because they were overlooked, hidden in plain sight. By now, the investigation had crossed a threshold. The question was no longer if Anna Walshe had met with foul play. It was how much of it had already been uncovered. As authorities prepared to move forward, the case took on a new gravity. Public concern intensified. Legal lines were drawn. And for the first time since Anna vanished, the investigation wasn't just building toward answers. It was building toward accountability. In the next part, the focus would turn to what happens when evidence, suspicion, and law converge, and how a missing person case becomes something far more serious. By the time investigators reached this stage, the direction of the case had fundamentally changed. What began as a missing person investigation was no longer defined by uncertainty. It was now defined by action. With mounting evidence, digital records, surveillance footage, and physical findings, authorities moved forward. The quiet disappearance of Anna Walshe was no longer being treated as an unexplained absence. It was being treated as a crime. Anna's husband was taken into custody. At first, the charges were limited. Investigators moved cautiously, aware of the weight of what they were alleging. But the arrest itself sent a clear message. This case had crossed a line. As details emerged, prosecutors outlined what they believed had happened in the days following Anna Walshe's disappearance. The narrative presented was no longer about confusion or miscommunication. It was about intent, concealment, and deliberate action. The public reaction was immediate: shock, anger, disbelief. A man who had spoken calmly to police, who had described a routine departure, who had framed the situation as ordinary, was now at the center of a case that bore no resemblance to his original account. Charges were upgraded. What had once been treated as misleading statements escalated into far more serious allegations. Each legal step rewrote the story of Anna Walshe's disappearance, transforming it from a mystery into a prosecution. And yet, even as the legal process advanced, one painful truth remained unchanged. Anna Walshe was still missing. No body had been recovered. No final location confirmed. No definitive account of her final moments. The case had gained structure, but it had not gained closure. For Anna's family, the arrest brought a complicated mix of emotions: relief that the investigation was moving forward, fear of what the evidence suggested, and the unbearable weight of knowing that answers, once imagined as distant, were now tied to someone they trusted. For the public, the case had become something else entirely. Not just the story of a woman who vanished days before her wedding, but the story of how carefully constructed narratives can collapse, and how a life can disappear while the truth hides in plain sight. As the legal process continued, investigators faced a final challenge. How do you prove what happened to Anna Walshe when the most important evidence may never be found? That question would linger as the case moved forward into courtrooms, headlines, and the slow grind of justice. And in the next part, we confront what remains unanswered and why this case continues to haunt so many who follow it. Even as arrests were made and charges filed, the case of Anna Walshe remained painfully incomplete. Because for all the evidence gathered, for all the timelines reconstructed, for all the narratives rewritten, the most important question was still unanswered. Where is Anna Walshe? Despite the seriousness of the charges, despite the weight of what investigators believe happened, Anna's remains have never been recovered. There is no confirmed final location, no physical space where her story can be brought to rest, and that absence changes everything. In court, cases can move forward on evidence, inference, and intent. But for families, closure often comes from something far simpler and far harder to accept: certainty. For Anna's loved ones, the legal process offers answers of one kind, but not the kind that brings peace. Each hearing, each update, reopens wounds. Each new detail forces them to imagine moments they were never meant to witness. And the uncertainty lingers. Questions remain about timing, about sequence, about what exactly happened during those final hours. What was said? What was understood? What went wrong inside a home that once felt ordinary? There are also questions the public continues to wrestle with. How does someone disappear without a trace in a modern world filled with cameras, records, and digital footprints? How much evidence is enough when the most definitive proof is missing? And how many cases exist where the truth is known but never fully seen? Anna Walshe's case sits uncomfortably in that space. A space where investigators believe they understand what happened, but cannot show everything. A space where justice moves forward, but certainty remains just out of reach. And perhaps the most haunting part of all is this: Anna Walshe did not vanish in a remote place. She did not disappear on a distant road. She was last known to be in the place where she should have been safest. That reality leaves a quiet, lasting impact on those who knew her and on those who follow her story from afar. Because when a case ends without answers, it doesn't really end at all. It waits, and as time passes, it leaves behind a question that refuses to fade. What happened to Anna Walshe? And will the full truth ever be known? In the final part, we step back from the details and reflect on the legacy of this case, what it reveals about trust, accountability, and why some stories continue to haunt us long after the headlines fade. Long after the headlines fade, some stories remain. The case of Anna Walshe is one of them. Not because of how it unfolded in public, but because of what it revealed behind closed doors. Anna's disappearance forced people to confront uncomfortable truths about trust, about appearances, and about how easily danger can hide within what looks like ordinary life: a home, a marriage, a routine. To the outside world, Anna was a professional, a mother, a woman planning her future. And yet, in the space of a single night, that future vanished, leaving behind questions that may never be fully answered. For Anna's family, the loss is not abstract. It is lived every day, in the silence where her voice should be, in milestones she will never see, in children who grow older without their mother. The legal process may continue. Arguments may be made. Evidence may be debated. But none of that restores what was taken. And perhaps that is the most haunting truth of all. Some losses cannot be undone. Some answers arrive too late. And some stories end without the closure we hope for. Anna Walshe's case stands as a reminder of how fragile trust can be and how quickly life can change when truth is hidden instead of spoken. It also reminds us why these stories matter. Because remembering Anna is not about speculation or headlines. It is about acknowledging a life that mattered, a future that was interrupted, and a responsibility to listen when silence feels wrong. As this story comes to a close, one question lingers not just for investigators, but for all of us. How many warning signs go unnoticed, simply because they are hidden in plain sight? If you believe these stories deserve to be told with care, truth, and respect, consider supporting this channel. Subscribe to Unsolved USA for more in-depth documentaries that seek understanding, not spectacle. And above all, remember Anna Walshe, because as long as her story is remembered, she is not forgotten.